Hare Krishna. Good evening and welcome back to the Atma Paradigm. We continue with part 3 of our series, which is on life, and we're now on session 3 of this part. So 3.3 is life forms, variation and speciation. Now, today we're going to be talking about the huge range of all the forms of life we have on Earth. And we look at the question if we can explain this diversity using the standard process proposed for evolutionary speciation, specifically the neo-Darwinian model called the modern synthesis. But before we get into that, a little recap from last week. We considered the origins of the first form of life on Earth, based on the assumption that there must have been a single living thing that started the whole scene, according to the kind of evolutionary model. Now, what emerged was that there is no standard model or specific theory for how or what that life form would have been, nor what would be the chemical route to produce that first life, nor where or in what circumstance it might have happened. Indeed, it seems that the latest thinking on this subject requires us to assume that all the factors for producing a first living cell would require the simultaneous generation of a suitable functioning membrane, the genetic materials that are needed for reproduction, and all the biological ingredients, the proteins and enzymes that are required to maintain the metabolic processes within that cell. Now, because there are a number of chicken and egg relationships between these different factors, the membrane, the reproduction genetic material, and the proteins, etc., it requires each facet, practically speaking, to be spontaneously produced, everything at once. And we looked at the issue at the heart of trying to explain these complex and interdependent components and processes that would be part even of the first simplest living cell. And that issue was, of course, what we call the problem of information. Where does the information that specifies structure and the order and the processes within such an entity as the first life form, where does that come from? And this can be summed up in a simple question: how can a high information system, such as a living cell, no matter how simple you think that will be, it's still a high information system, how does that arise from processes which are themselves low information? And the systems that are proposed for prebiotic self-assembly, or what is called abiogenesis, rely on these simple processes of random interactions happening in nature. And these processes are low information. They have very limited capacity for organizational information. So there seems to be a rather blind reliance on low information processes to deliver a high information system. And by not identifying a specific cause for self-assembly organization other than chance interactions based on the kind of the existing properties of these simple components, well, it's impossible to establish this proposition of abiogenesis, self-assembly, on a scientific or empirical footing. And the point we are making within the Atma paradigm is we don't have to just believe that high information states can arise from these sort of processes, when we know we already have a source of specifying information. That is something we have talked about rather a lot in all of these subjects. The source of specifying information: consciousness. We know consciousness is a source of information. We now know from what we studied in previous talks, it has the ability to manipulate matter. We know biology doesn't produce consciousness. Rather, it accommodates and facilitates it. And that's why we've been stressing this point so much. Consciousness is not physical. It is a separate aspect of reality. And therefore, we have to look at life from that perspective and stop thinking of life in terms of just being something that arises out of material organization. So from this perspective of consciousness, if biological forms accommodate the presence of consciousness and facilitate its expression, i.e. its expression of will through the use of a physical body, it seems reasonable that consciousness may itself play a part in producing that which it later utilizes. So our experience, when we look around at what life is and what it does, is that life appears to come from life. And the Atma Paradigm proposition is that the original forms of life arise from the key component of life, not biological bits and pieces, but the key component of life, which is the source of consciousness. Now, these ideas were going to be developed in the later talks of this part 3 of our series, but we first continue to consider the processes that are said to be at work within biology, particularly within the evolutionary model. So last week we looked at the self-assembly of the first cell, and today we're now going to look at the variety of life forms that we see around us. And we're going to do this from the perspective of the standard evolutionary theory of speciation. So life, there's lots of it, and it's everywhere. And it comes in all sorts of varieties. Basically, there's these 6 types of animal groups: the invertebrates, the fish, the amphibians and reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, including ourselves. Plus, there's also insects to consider, and arachnids, which are slightly different, and all the plants. And then that doesn't include the other domains of life that we talked about last week, bacteria and the archaea. So this raises a natural question. You got so many, there's so many different, where did they all come from? And here's how we're going to try to address that question. This is a kind of summary of where we are going within these next 6 talks. Our first objective is to try and free ourselves from maybe some of the preconceptions that we might have been given as we grew up through school and university. So free ourselves from those conceptions to explore what we know to be true of life and biological systems, really from a kind of first principle basis. So for that, we're going to consider the various processes and evidence that are presented in support of evolutionary theory, and we'll try to identify those aspects that we can have confidence in. And these may include natural selection, adaptation and variation within a population of species. And we'll then consider if these processes are sufficient to produce the extent of variation that could account for the divergence of a species into an entirely distinct new species. Then, next week, we'll consider other evidence that's offered in support of the evolution of species, and we'll determine what that evidence most clearly reveals to us. Following all of that, we'll kind of bank it, and we'll step back and do a grassroots analysis of the phenomenon of life from a consciousness-based perspective. And this may reveal further factors which could be at play, factors that the standard evolutionary ideas do not include. And these factors may actually open up new potential for understanding the workings of biology. And I think it's going to be a perspective of biology that resolves many of the difficulties and anomalies that the standard evolutionary theory and standard views of biology contain. So from all of this, I think we will have a new vision for the appearance, proliferation, and adaptation of life on Earth. And along the way, we'll uncover many fascinating ideas that may revolutionize the concept of our own existence. So let's start with this question about life. Why is there so much of it in all of its many forms? And to deal with that, we have to address the question, what do we mean by a species? What's a species? Kind of important. If we're going to discuss where all the different species of life come from, we should be able to distinguish one species from another and know where one species starts and where it finishes and another one begins. And it's not as straightforward as it's often suggested. A standard version is that a species is a group that can breed amongst its own members, but not with other groups. Now, this simple version actually is just one of many, many definitions that are active within the classification of living things. They're reckoned between 26 and 32 different ways to categorize a species. However, I'm going to take you through 5 of the main contenders. So 5 different views on how to define what a species is. The first one, biological, and this is probably the one that you've heard about before, that a species is one that cannot produce one species cannot reproduce with another species to produce a fertile offspring. They may mate in some way, but they may even produce an offspring, but that offspring will not be fertile. It will not be able to have its own children. Now that sounds simple. However, of course, it only applies to those species that reproduce sexually. And there are many that don't, in the different kind of orders of life. But since the mammals and the ones in this picture tend to do that, then this is how we kind of think of speciation. But not as simple. Some varieties of one species choose not to mate with one another, or are unable to because of practicalities, such as size or shape. And some creatures, which are considered to be definitely different species, seem to be able to mate with fertile offspring. And we come across more and more of these as kind of we encounter the natural world. I was reading one recent story of the growlar. A growlar is the offspring of a grizzly bear and a polar bear. And it happened in kind of northern Canada, where the two of them got together. But the growler that had been found was second generation, which basically means that it was the grandchild of the grizzly and polar bear. That means that their child had been fertile and been able to produce this growler. So grizzlies and polars, are they now not to be called different species? How does this work? The next one is morphological. This categorizes speech according to their body shapes and maybe physical appearance and traits. So this is the system that kind of arose from all the amateur naturalists of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And sometimes they had a strange idea of what might be a morphological difference and that should be used to constitute a different species. For instance, Mr. Linnaeus, who very famously is credited with the two-name Latinized taxonomy system that we all use, his first idea for categorizing plants was that you could sort them into groups based on the numbers of male stamens and female pistils of their flowers. So you can look at a flower that produces sexually like this, and you can say, oh, it's got 2 stamens and it's got 4 pistils. Ah, that must be grouped with another flower that has 2 and 4, and so on. And he did a whole study of this, of all the different plants. The only problem was that the ones that seemed to have the same number of stamens and pistils didn't seem to have any other kind of relationship to one another, and whereas others, which would have been considered to be one type, a lily for instance, have loads of different types of numbers of stamens and pistils. So his system went awry, and perhaps there is that difficulty with the morphological approach, that what are you looking at and what are you categorizing as more important? Which part of that creature? And where do you draw the line? And this is the big one. Where do you draw the line between what is just a variation within a species and when that variation is so different that it really is a distinct species? And it seems that often naturalists are too quick to pronounce a new species for something that may just be a local strain of an existing species. Then we have dating. Or genetic, sorry, next one is genetic. This would seem to be the most modern and obviously scientific. And it has indeed kind of revolutionized our concept of species, and, you know, we're able to look at the DNA sequencing of the whole genome of these different species, and perhaps you try and use that to set up what we call the tree of life, the kind of how all the different species may be related together. But it's not without its problems. It has the similar issue with the tiny morphological things. You know, you may have difficulty deciding what is really the difference of a species in terms of a tiny physical difference. And you have the same problem with the genetic variance, because what is the genetic variance within a species and where does it really constitute a different species? And this is complicated. And so it's become the sort of standard for discerning possible evolutionary relationships. But as we're going to show next week, this has its problems, because when you look at one gene within the genome and say, well, where did that gene come from? How does it relate to this gene in another creature that we think was its predecessor? You can kind of go back and try and compare that. But if you use a different gene from the descendant and go back to find its predecessor, you'll get a different picture. So it's not as straightforward and as simple as I think people would like. Then we have dating. Now, this is dating not in terms of working out a historical time, but dating as in looking for potential mates. And the biologists have given it this title. So this system is the idea that why should we decide what a species is on the basis of what they want to mate with? Why not let the species themselves decide who they wish to mate with, and based on the principle that birds of a feather flock together. So the logic is that a species will normally try to unite with a male that is like them, mate rather, is like them, and will produce offspring of the same type. And this is true much of the time. But deep in the forest, some critters do get lonely. Then phylogenetic. Now, in this case, the species is defined as one which is on the same twig of the tree of life. Now, in order to use this type of definition, you have to have a tree of life. And how have you produced that? Probably from one of the other methods. So I think the idea is that people feel that, well, if we use all the other different methods and set up a tree of life, then we'll just, whatever this tree of life is, we'll use that to say which is a species and which is it's not. It's probably easier to use this type of system for classifying bigger categories like families and orders rather than individual species. So there are, as I said, lots more definitions of species that we could use or choose from. Each is going to have the strength and utility. But overall, what has to be clear is that there is still great debate what constitutes an individual species. Where does that boundary lie between this species and another thing that seems to be similar or closely related? Now, I just want to note that for now I'm using the term species in the general way, as it is used on discussion on speciation, which I'll come to in a moment. But it's also worth noting that the concept of species, as presented in the Puranas and the Vedas, is a very different concept. And I recommend that you do not try to conflate the two together. Later on, I'm going to show you how the Puranic concept of a species type, as what is called in Sanskrit Jiva Jati, can help understand the nature of life and its forms, and perhaps provide us with another definition of what we mean by a species of life. But now, having looked at what a species is, let's look at the process that is said to be the change of one species into another. So that's called speciation. And it's said that speciation is still the biggest mystery at the heart of biology. We still don't understand it. The process by which one species changes into another and is no longer able to breed with the previous species. That's kind of how it is being defined. Now, this obviously links with evolution, but there's a slight difference. Here, evolution is change in the heritable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. The change in the heritable characteristics, those characteristics would be passed down between one generation and the next. Now, that alone doesn't constitute speciation. The way that definition of evolution is worded doesn't necessarily mean that one generation may change into another. It may just have changed within itself. So the question is whether the changes that are brought about by the evolutionary process over successive generations can produce such significant change in characteristics to warrant classifying the later generation as a new, distinct species. So this keeps raising the question, what are the boundaries of biological variation related to defining a new species? How much internal change can a species include? And as we've discovered with the definition of a species, the boundaries of what a particular species are not fixed. They're not objective. So there is a lot of room for subjectivity and maybe guesswork within this process. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia definition of evolution says that evolution typically refers to the changes in the proportions of biological types, in a population over time. This suggests a further level of subjectivity. At what point do changes in the proportions of a population constitute speciation? I.e., when they affect some or most of all the population, or all of them? When is speciation? When does it occur? And this is important when we come now to looking at the process by which evolutionary characteristics occur and seem to be passed on. There's only one process at work, but it appears to have two broad stages. The first they call microevolution, the changes that occur to the characteristics of a population within a species. So the population of one particular species, they may go through changes. And I've shown a human here against a door in a castle. Why? Because way back in the medieval times, humans could happily fit through that door. And that's all the size it needed to be. But now we seem to be bigger. You could say that is microevolution. The characteristics, our physical size has changed over these centuries, mostly to do with better diet and lifestyle and so on. So this is species development. But we're not saying we are a different species from that smaller human who ran around in medieval times. Whereas macroevolution, that's dealing with the change of one species into another. And I'm showing Darwin's finches here, which are one of the best known examples given for macroevolution. So change of one species into another, or also the divergence of one species splitting into two lines, which become different, recognized as different species. So either one species changes into something new, or one species branches into two lines and becomes two new species. So for most purposes, people regard speciation and macroevolution to refer to the same thing. Many evolutionists are eager to avoid the two being thought of. They don't want us to think of micro and macro evolution as separate. They say, well, it's all evolution. They sometimes try to separate speciation, that microevolution produces speciation, a change into a new species, and that macroevolution is then what happens with more proliferation of that new species. So one reason why there's this contention that we should only think of evolution as one thing, whether it's micro or macro, is because there is only one process at work, and it is the process assigned to microevolution. So the type of evolution I mentioned earlier, producing slight changes from one generation to the next. That is the only process that is quoted for possible speciation. Okay, so the idea is that this process first produces small changes within a population, but they're still the same species. Then under certain circumstances, those small changes may add up to a major drift of characteristics, so much so that the population may be different from and possibly cannot reproduce with the old one. And at this point they say, speciation, macroevolution has said to have happened. A second reason is that this point of speciation isn't clearly defined. That's why it's better to kind of keep evolution as all the changes, because you don't know really when speciation happens, and it's contentious. So better the boundary at which speciation happens is not always obvious, even when we look back on it. But a third reason for trying to combine micro and macro is that all of the evidence for the process of macroevolution, as well as much of the other justification that is given for it, is based on what is observed as change within a species, i.e. it's evidence for process of microevolution. Now, what are these elements that make up the processes for evolutionary change? Well, there's three: natural selection, genetic variation, and circumstances which produce reproductive separation. And we're going to start with natural selection. So this is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive so as to produce more offspring. Okay? So it's a real effect, you know, and I believe that natural selection does what it says on the tin here. It's a real effect, and we should be clear what it is, what it does, what it can do, what it can't do. And it also may be a slight misnomer because it suggests selection for survival. And we'll see that that may not be so accurate. Here's a good analogy for natural selection. You've got these two characters, the man and the woman, up. They're hikers up there in the Rocky Mountains. They meet a grizzly bear. The woman calls out, "Let's run for it." But the man thinks he knows better and says, "You can't outrun a bear." The woman replies, "I don't have to. I just have to run faster than you." And that's how natural selection works. The bear will catch one of them, but it's going to catch the slower runner, the poor man in this case. And the woman can go off and happily reproduce and pass on her extraordinary running skills to the next generation. Whereas the human race has now been spared having a slow runner such as this man. So in this way, the bear has contributed to changing the proportions of the running ability within the human race. Now, it's not much of an effect with one person, but if we did the experiment by sending everyone up in pairs to be chased by bears, then over time, the average running speed of humans would definitely increase. However, not necessarily the fastest speed that they can run at, just at the average, because the slower runners are being removed from the gene pool. We're weeding out the less capable. And of course, this is the joke with the Darwin Awards. You know, it's a kind of tragic recognition of this ability of natural selection to weed out the less able, or in this case, the less sensible persons in society. And this is one reason that natural selection might be a misleading title for the process. It is natural, it's a process that carried out naturally within nature, but is it selection? Or rather, is it seeming selection? Is this seeming selection actually selecting for survival or for elimination? Consider this box of chocolates. It's the prey. It's arrived in your home. You're there with the family. A box of assorted chocolates, all sorts of flavors and textures, and you know, all there. And you and the family are the predators. Okay, so you immediately pounce in and devour your favorites. I would go for the caramel creams, and then go for our next favorites before the rest of the family nab them. And then we're down to just a few now, and you know, they're not going as quickly because not everyone really likes them this much, until at last we have a winner. What is it? Coffee cream, Turkish delight. But was it selected? Well, actually, obviously it wasn't selected. You know, all the others were selected in preference to it. But really what has happened is that natural selection has eliminated all the others. It is natural elimination. And of course, who or what did the so-called selecting of this one? We didn't do the selecting of it. We did the selecting of all the others. The environment didn't choose it. Nature didn't. So really, can we say this is selection by something, even by nature? So I'm bringing this up because I think that the term natural selection is given more poetic power than maybe it really deserves. And we should be really clear about the extent of its capabilities. Natural selection does not add any new information. C.S. Lewis had a good analogy for it. He said, natural selection is like a non-creative editor. It deletes information, but it cannot write information. So it doesn't change the genes of an individual. It makes no change on the individual. That's not what natural selection does. It doesn't produce any new feature in an organism. So what does it do? Well, it simply favors the existing traits of certain individuals over the traits of other individuals. And by doing that, it varies the proportions of the existing varieties within any group. As we said, it may remove the slow runners within the human population, as an example. So running ability is diverse. The slower runners are going to get eaten by the bears. So one of the best examples which kind of clarifies this is the one that's quoted in pretty well every book and textbook and website on the subject. And that is the peppered moth. Now, the peppered moth has two forms, the light and the dark form. And the way it's presented is that in the olden days, before the Industrial Revolution, only 2% of the population of peppered moths were dark. The rest were kind of this mottled grey light form. So the story goes that from the 18th century on, we had the Industrial Revolution in the Midlands of England. It was churning out coal-fired soot, which was lying on the trees and plants. And this might have made the light-coloured moths more visible to their predators, whereas the dark ones were being hidden. Now, there's a question over this process, but still, it's used by others, and I'm using it because it still demonstrates the capabilities of natural selection. So the light ones are getting eaten more often. So they're becoming fewer and fewer within the overall population, whereas the dark ones are happily reproducing because no one seems to be bothered with them. So they're increasing. So the idea is that after the Industrial Revolution, 95% of the moths were now dark. And this is evolution at work. Where? What's changed? Just the proportions of their presence? Yes, and that was an effect of natural selection. But there was two types of genetic varieties before, and there's two types after. Nothing has changed. One hasn't changed into another. They haven't changed into anything else. So it's not really a very kind of effective idea. If you call this evolution, fine, but this has no part really in speciation. It's not a move towards speciation. So it's not a good example of the power of natural selection to help speciation, which is why it needs extra help. Natural selection happens, it's natural, it's simple. You have the chance of being more selected for university, for instance, if you're smart or if you work hard. It's as simple as that. So it's no dispute that it works, but it's just limited because it offers no additional information. It doesn't produce the variety that it needs in order to select amongst. It can only act on the difference of traits that already exist within a community. So, for instance, if everyone gets the same grade at school, how do you select between them? You need there to be differences between them. So only when there are differences of traits can natural selection decide that I'm going to eliminate the weaker ones. So, in the case of the peppered moth, the species has survived through the change in circumstances because there were two manifest variants of the species. Before, when the light were favored, they were more prominent. And okay, a lot of them got eaten, but they're still hanging on in there. They're still present. So, but that trait, that lighter form, is now seriously weakened in its numbers. So imagine what had happened if the situation had gone on for a little longer and all of the light ones had disappeared entirely, so only the dark ones remained. Now, that might lead you to say that speciation had occurred, but still, no. We still have just got one of the two variants that we used to have. So we've got a smaller gene pool. Previously, there was two types who could benefit from different circumstances. Now we've only got one type. And this is a danger for the future of the species. Because if there's any further change to the circumstance, one that is disadvantaged to darker forms, for instance, which is happening, that now that we don't have the same type of pollution in the Industrial Revolution, at least not the coal-fired stuff, the countryside is becoming lighter. Maybe the dark ones are now going to be very vulnerable to prey as they were in the past. But there is no white ones now, or light ones to expand and take their place. So this could lead the species to extinction. So natural selection actually cuts down the opportunities and the potential of a large gene pool into smaller and smaller groupings, which make them more vulnerable for extinction. So not actually a help for survival in that respect. Now, natural selection works only on traits that vary amongst the population. So we've talked about that. And those traits have to have certain features. One is that they have to enhance an individual's ability to survive to reproductive age. If the trait doesn't help something survive until it's able to reproduce, there will be no benefit to the speciation. We're talking now about what is needed for those traits to actually help the concept of speciation. So the other thing is that reproductivity. So we need the trait to improve the chances. It can either help the survival to reproductive age, that's good, or it must help reproductivity. It has to help that creature become more fertile and maybe produce more offspring than others. Now, there isn't an awful lot in the literature about that effect. However, the reproductivity is linked to another factor, and that is mating desirability. And this is considered to be a big deal as a factor for speciation, because this comes in all sorts of situations. You know, you've got features of male and female that indicate fertility, strength, and status. So the idea is that if a male is showing itself to be strong and a good provider, you know, it'll be more desirable. Its genes and will become prominent within the lineage, and so on. So, or if, for instance, and this sometimes there's examples of this with birds, if they exhibit a new novel feature like an extra feather, you know, or a new song, then their mate might find that attractive. So they become more desirable and their features may become more prominent in the line. So mating preferences certainly help to establish healthy or even novel attractive features in the group. And this is considered as a key factor leading to speciation. However, several definitions of a species rely on the idea that actually a species is one that mates within itself. So it doesn't seem that even if there is mating desirability, that is helping a species change into another species. So when we talk of traits that are found to be attractive, desirable, or intentionally favored by living things, what are we bringing into the picture now? We're bringing in the role of consciousness and the individual making willful, intentional choices about what it likes, what it wants to achieve. Now we'll hold on for that for a moment. Now, and of course, these different traits that natural selection is working on, the big one is they have to be heritable. Because it's no point having a trait that can't be passed on to the next generation. That will not change the proportion of the population. So it isn't just a question of living long enough to reproduce. It isn't just you have to be able to pass on your special characteristics to your offspring. If they die with you and they haven't been passed on, well, they're not going to make any effect on the population of that species. So, now since the 19th century, of course, we've known that there is certain hereditary traits. And the idea, and it was given the idea that somehow or other these are passed on by genes, something inside us. But the studies indicated that genes seem to be pretty stable. There were varieties and strains of a species, and you could mix them into hybrids through breeding, which was very popular here in Britain. But what was found is the original types tended to keep reasserting themselves. And examples of this are in the breeding of pigeons. And here we have our doves and pigeons. And the breeding of these was offered actually by Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species in one of his first chapters as a way of understanding modification by descent over generations. But basically, doves and pigeons are one type. Now, we have a colony of white doves in the home next to me, in the barns of the farm next to me. They actually escaped from an estate 10 miles away where they were being bred very carefully. However, I've been watching him in the barns over the past 5 years or so. And what is happening is that certain pigeon features are now reappearing amongst members of the colony. Here is a bunch of them sitting out on the telephone line the other day. And I've ringed the ones that are showing recessive features. They're not pigeons. They're not quite like pigeons. They just seem to have certain dark feathers in different places that are at odds with them being doves. Now, of course, if they were back at that estate being bred, those ones would not be used for breeding. So it's this gives an idea of how people understood that the original genes seem to reassert themselves. Another example, of course, was in the plant world. Here are hybrids which are brought from India, from the Himalayas, rhododendrons, and planted in all the gardens in the 19th century. And we had them here at Buckland Hall. And beautiful hybrids, loads and loads of different colours. However, leave them on their own and they revert to the rhododendron ponticum, the standard lilac version. So what was realised, that genes themselves aren't producing the variations that we need, because they seem to kind of bring things back to their normal state. You need something more at work. So hybridization, breeding, they don't permanently change the genetic information of a species. What is there that might do that? So in the early 20th century, there was a notion that maybe genetic mutations could help. Maybe they might produce heritable variation. And by linking natural selection with the idea of mutations, what was then later became known as the modern synthesis, or sometimes called the neo-Darwinian model of evolution. The idea that mutations happen randomly within nature, they're accidental, but they produce heritable changes in the genome of an individual. And these genetic changes produce new or enhanced features within a particular individual. Something that makes that individual better able to reproduce than the rest of the gang. And it is also possible to pass it on to its offspring. So if those conditions are met, then natural selection will be able to do its thing and make it more likely that new genes will start to be spread amongst the species. So mutations need to have several key factors. First, they need to be regular or numerous. They need to be favorable, they need to be significant, and they need to be heritable. Let me take you through each of those. First of all, regular. They need to be reasonably numerous enough to affect a population. If it's just one and maybe it gets to reproduce, maybe it doesn't, maybe its offspring die, then that change disappears. So for a particular beneficial mutation to have an impact, it needs to occur to many individuals simultaneously, or to happen to individuals within a close set of generations, so that you get to have a state of having many lineages of that mutant variety within the group, so that it can become more common and start to spread amongst the species population. Now, mutations are produced randomly in nature, but they are rare. And humans, we have exacerbated it with our radiation, our chemicals and pollutions and other things. But in nature, it's not that common. It's amazing it's not common, because every time the DNA chain is replicated, there are probably about 100 errors, but most of them are just irrelevant. And there is an error correction system within the cell that runs up and down the new chain and tries to fix any mistake that has existed within replication. But still, something may get through. Now, quoting the literature, they say the vast majority of mutations are neutral or deleterious. The beneficial mutations are very rare. So even out of rare mutations, it's even rarer for them to be beneficial. But people believe that it is possible that they might aggregate under certain conditions. If Now, it's hard to get examples of beneficial mutations that we know are indeed mutations and not features of an original species. And the best examples that I think are quoted for humans are resistance to certain illnesses. You see someone who is kind of unusually well, and you might say, well, he seems to have certain genes that may contribute to that. Or there's a story of one person who had unusual bone structure, which was thicker than normal, and he survived a very nasty car crash unscathed. Now, predilection to or immunity from disease is an aspect of something that could be favorable or unfavorable, so it is important. And these could have an effect on survival and reproducing. So, a definite candidate for natural selection to work on, but hardly sufficient to really say we've got speciation happening, just because we have maybe more people who are more vulnerable to this, or more people who are lactose intolerant than another. It doesn't really change the species. So when mutations do affect physiognomy, are they favorable? Not really. They tend to have this sort of impact. They change the form of what something should have been into something which we think that doesn't look right. It changes the number of a particular organ. Like here we have a tortoise with two heads. It changes the color. Instead of this red or grey squirrel, we've now got a white one. Maybe it'll be very popular amongst the mates, but we'll see. Or it can change the position by which an organ or a wing appears. So form, number, position, color. These are the sort of things that mutation can do to the bodily form of a creature. Basically, they're not producing anything new. What they are doing is mutations are either stopping proteins being produced or producing the wrong proteins, excuse me, and that disrupts the pathways of morphology. It disrupts the way the cells are working together in order to form a body in the normal way that it does. So they disrupt. They're not adding new novel functions or new organs or new superpowers. 99.9999% are not beneficial. And it's very hard to really build a whole science of speciation on this level of improbability. And these examples also indicate the limitations of the effects that we can expect from mutations. They're supposed to be random, so there's no new specifying information. And genetic information is very sensitive to being precise. Last week we talked about Craig Ventner stitching together 1 million base pairs to copy a functioning genome of a simple organism. During the process, they made one little error, one wrong base pair, and the DNA wouldn't work in the cell. So they had to spend another 3 months going back over to correct that single mistake. Now, so a mutation, they're limited in what they can actually achieve, and it hardly seems viable that they are producing the sort of traits that natural selection could then work on in order to produce speciation. Now, the other thing, of course, is that they have to be heritable. For instance, if they're not, as we said, if they're not passed down to one's offspring, then they are not playing their part in speciation. So where do mutations occur? There are two types of cell in organisms that reproduce sexually. There's the soma cells, which are the ones that make up the workings and the main form of the body. And there's the germ cells, and they're the ones that hold and pass on the heritable information to the next generation. And in the past, they were believed that there was absolutely nothing connecting them. Now we believe that there is some little connection. But in simple terms, if mutation occurs in a soma cell, it might affect physically the physicality of the creature, but not necessarily that mutation would be passed on. But if the mutation happens in the germline, it could be passed on, but not necessarily available for use in determining a new feature of the body. So a germline mutation might simply influence one's predisposition or immunity to a particular disorder, but it is not producing features, physical features, that are often used to discuss and present the idea of macroevolution speciation. So, stepping back, even if we do get a heritable trait produced by some random mutation, and it was significant or numerous enough to change the makeup of a group, it still only represents a minor adjustment to the characteristics of the existing species at that time in history. So it has to be questioned if this actually represents an actual change of the species type. That's why we need a further factor to try and account for serious divergence of a species. And basically this is reproductive separation with lots of time. The idea is that we have to separate one group of a species from another, which might have possible differences in it, and keep them separate so that they gradually develop different traits, so that they no longer relate or mate with one another, and then it can be claimed that speciation has occurred. So the one line of a species diverging into two distinct lineages. Now there's 4 types of reproductive separation that are quoted. The first one, and they're actually all quite related together, it may almost be impossible to tell them apart. Allopatric. Allopatric speciation relies on something, a real geographical feature, such as a river. In this case, you've got a group of insects, and somehow or other the river has separated them into 2 groups, and then they sort of kind of go their own way. Now, the barrier does not be perfect. A little intermingling is okay, but basically after a long time being these 2 populations of the one species being separated, they might produce different characteristics. Now, those characteristics may be consistent with the original gene pool of the original species. So really they are strains or races or variants of the one species. But they appear to be different, and they may choose or not wish or not be able to repeat mate with one another. The next one is peripatric. Now, practically speaking, this is the same. It's just that instead of a kind of big difference between, sort of the population being halved, we're really just dealing with a very small number of them in this case. But the idea that in a small group, maybe genes might become more easily spread and new traits become more prevalent amongst them, which might make them different from the previous. Parapatric is where the 2 groups have a mingling zone, a hybrid zone. So it's like allopatric, but they're not fully separated. And I was part of a parapatric speciation experiment when I grew up in Belfast. This was an attempt by my forefathers to keep Protestant species distinct from the Catholic species. So we were separated as far as possible geographically within the same city. There was walls, there was roads, there was areas that we inhabited and they inhabited. We were separated socially in different schools, in different churches or chapels, in social clubs and sports teams, both as fans and players. We were kept way apart, and we kind of diverged in our own way. But there were areas that overlapped, like hospital discos, where the sort of hybrid zone. And it was now realized that actually these 2 species, the Protestants and Catholics, did interbreed together. So I kind of appreciate these kind of examples. But there's a 4th type. Sympatric speciation is said to occur when there is one part of the original group that is still living within the rest of the group, but becomes isolated or differentiated in its behavior. And probably the best example of that, of behavior that makes a difference like this, is what they might like to eat. For instance, certain insects, all of one species, some start to eat one food and others another. And it can be quite different, from a hawthorn berry or something, and another is eating an apple, whatever it is. But from that, they may seem to develop differences in digestive processes. Is this a new species, or just one group adapting to the favouring of another type of food and developing some particular circumstances? And perhaps within the human species, one example we could use like this are vegans. They're the same species as other humans, but they're undergoing adaptation from their life choices. Their internal biology may subtly change, and their mating habits may become restricted, as they probably never want to mate with anyone other than another vegan. Now, this might seem an irrelevant joke at the expense of well-intended vegans, and I apologize for that, but it's a real example of radical divergence of behavior by a particular subset of the human species. And in the future, we'll assess the impact that such conscious intention, psychology, and choice, when applied to lifestyle, food, mate, etc., has on the physical and genetic diversification within a species. There's a real effect at work here. It's not as described in macroevolution and neo-Darwinian ideas, but it can be established on the basis of understanding the power of consciousness. So the Atma Paradigm, to start summing up now, raises the question, is any of this actually speciation, the production of a new species? Or are we seeing just that there are many variants possible within a species? For instance, I take you back to Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. You know, the standard example of speciation. Here we see the large ground finch and the small ground finch. And there's plenty to distinguish between them. There is empirically observed evidence that these two types of finch might have diverged from a common stock. But when I give you that evidence, it tells a different story. Because in a recent documentary on the Galapagos, David Attenborough, who we all trust, noted that we have witnessed these finches changing within just a few years. Previously, these two types of finches enjoyed different foods, which their eating features, their beaks, etc. were well suited to. But because of tourism and the abundance of human food waste, these birds are giving up their previous diet and enjoying human junk food. The result is that their own features, including their beaks, are retro-evolving. The two species are now merging back into an original common form. And what this tells us is that the divergence of appearance and habits really represents only a variation within the potential range of a single type. Plus, it means that there is a change in how their genes are being expressed. And this is a major point to understand. That what we're beginning to realize is the incredible range of variation that exists within the original genetic potential of any organism. It doesn't have to be newly acquired mutations. The original genetic potential is huge. Now, genetics is a big, complex subject, and we will be referring to it in future talks. Just for now, we need to kind of try and remove any of the misconceptions established in people's minds, perhaps by the general presentations. So we're only exploring certain key issues of how DNA is working within the cell. So we'll be doing this in topic number 6. For now, I just want you to appreciate the incredible scope that DNA of every organism offers the members of that particular species. There's huge array of variations within what DNA can produce. It's not just to do with the number of genes, it's how those genes are connected and relate to one another and joined up and stitched together. It's how certain genes are turned on and off. There is seemingly unlimited potential for them. So these recent insights into the workings of DNA should encourage us to reconsider the rather simplistic assumptions that are being used in neo-Darwinian speciation ideas. So this is the diagram I showed earlier, that natural selection and mutations lead to microevolution within a species, that leads to speciation, that species becoming something different, and that just keeps on proliferating into what we call macroevolution. Thus, there's one process at work is meant to producing all the others. But what we have seen is that the diagram should really look like this. The standard process described for microevolution can at best produce only intra-species, not intra, within a species variants. But it does not produce, and it cannot be shown to produce, it cannot be demonstrated that it has the power to produce speciation and macroevolution. So 2 key points to take away as we kind of come to our conclusions. The process of natural selection, mutations, and reproductive separation are not sufficient to substantiate speciation. And all we can say from the evidence regarding microevolution is that small changes happen. But to what extent, that is a question. There is variation and diversification. Sometimes it seems substantial within pretty well every species, and certainly amongst those species that reproduce sexually. That is even stated in the Bhagavatam. That is the process at work. And this produces a wide range of variants devolved from the original stock. And it is possible that all of these devolved variants are produced thanks to the incredible potential for variety that exists within the original DNA of that species type. So it's a devolved process, not something which is new and being added to, a devolved process. We'll talk about more as we get into the presentation of the Atma Paradigm thesis on this. But just to make the second point, that the Atma Paradigm has a different view on these processes and on the processes that are at work. So here on this slide we have said, what processes? Because we need to look, natural selection maybe, mutation, there are maybe other processes which are at work which facilitate this variation within a species. And we'll present those and start presenting and looking at the role of those from talk number 3.4. Now, before we get to that, perhaps someone might ask, well, okay, you've shown that there is a problem with the process of microevolution, perhaps. Maybe there are some questions about it. But is there not other evidence that substantiates the idea of macroevolution? And the answer is that, well, there's certainly other evidence that is offered to substantiate it. And that will be the subject of next week's talk. So, I think if there's any, I don't think we have time for any questions. I'm afraid we have run over our time, but I look forward to meeting you all next week when we will look at the evidence on evolution and how fossils and other evidence reveal a very different picture of how life appears on Earth. Thank you very much, and that concludes our talk for tonight. See you all.